My name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, Shorts. There's no co-host on these Shorts episodes. We have extended the time on these shorter episodes from 5 to 6 minutes to 15 to 20 minutes for this season. This is so that these shorts can serve as introductory episodes released ahead of our weekly, longer form episodes. But don't worry, I will still let you know my observations, ideas, thoughts, or rants about the literature, philosophy, psychology, and even the theology of leadership, particularly as we prepare for the restoration of leadership and leadership principles during the next historical high in America. Why these episodes? Well, because listening to me talk about leadership for now around 15 to 20 minutes is still better than reading and trying to understand yet another business book. Even that business book that you bought with that famous person's name as the author, but you haven't applied any of the principles from that book to your leadership practices. At least not yet. I recently watched the 2023 film Zone of Interest. Based on the book written by Martin Amis and directed by Jonathan Glazer, the story is about the commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, and his wife as they strive to build a quote-unquote dream life for their family in a house next to the death camp known as Auschwitz. The movie represents, for a variety of reasons, the last gasp of the baby boomer generation hagiography of the myths of World War II. Along with the 2025 film Nuremberg, this film looks old and feels old because the ideas of the battle of the values behind it are old. At some point in the next 25 years, we will start getting novels and perhaps even films about the Weimar Republic that preceded World War II Germany and its chaotic cultural excesses. These works will, of course, for the Zoomer generation, parallel in their minds the most recent cultural degeneracy and chaos they have been silent witness to in the United States during the early 21st century. These works will, from a boomer perspective, and maybe even from a millennial and Gen X perspective, be seen as forgiving and quote-unquote whitewashing, a past we should all collectively quote-unquote never forget in the West, but that we have already practically forgotten because the passage of time inevitably erodes values. This observation about the shift in values between generations is not new. But what is new is the idea that we are arguing culturally at cross purposes. Americans like the fight, as I've said before on this show, but I'm beginning to wonder if we are struggling because we aren't sure what we're fighting for exactly. So when we read books on this podcast and we try to glean lessons for leaders from those books, we often pick books in which the lessons are not obvious. And our book today, our book this week, The Optimist's Daughter, is one of those books. The lessons from these books are not floating on the surface. You have to read the book. You have to absorb it in order to discern the lesson. Or you need to probably listen deeply to the show in order to get to the actual meat of the matter. Now, this process can be frustrating for listeners who have been encultured on a cocktail that includes shallow information, short attention spans, knowledge separated from wisdom, and all delivered at ever higher and higher cultural decibel levels. Because, of course, when you have nothing to say, shouting louder and faster is always the way to make sure that you get the listener's attention. Writers like the author of The Optimist's Daughter, Eudora Welty, wrote from a time when the mystic chords of memory remained strong in the United States, and specifically in the American South. Welty could trace her lineage back through time, and she was one of the many cultural heirs to the writer William Faulkner. In our era, however, where ruthless globalization has flattened most regional ideas, dialects, and predilections into a paste of indistinguishable slop, Welty's writing was part of a tradition that sought to stand out, to make a point, and to be seen, but to do so quietly. She didn't yell. She joined knowledge and wisdom. She prioritized speaking and writing at a cultural decibel level that would barely even be heard these days. And that tradition is one where the arguments about values become quietly clear. Knowing those values which you are for, and then quietly, stolidly, and consistently committing to those values is what we are desperately thirsty for in a world of social communication that has abandoned principle in favor of marketing. So how does Eudora Welty, The Optimist's Daughter, relate to Zone of Interest and Nuremberg? Well, we stand at a weird cultural transitional moment in the West overall and in the United States in particular. The speed of the internet has, of course, convinced humanity, at least in the parts of the globe that I live in, that the speed of cultural evolution should match the speed with which an individual can order a latte via DoorDash from their phone. However, in the long course of history, that's never happened. Cultural evolution may seem to be faster in our time because of the ever-present nature of the internet and of internet-based communication, but in reality, cultural adoption of new ideas still takes at least 20 years, or the time it takes for a new generation of people to be born, raised, and mature enough to begin to assert themselves against reality. The return of pagan ideals, the rejection of modern and postmodern slop ideas, the return of ways of behaving that prioritize tradition, community, and above all else, cultural quietude, are beginning very gradually, if you know where to look, to make their presence known. These ideas, the return of these quote-unquote strong gods, will be assisted by the presence of various technological advancements, but those will just serve as the rail lines laid to deliver the ideas to a population shifting values across time and generations. There will be those who will be out of step, make no mistake. They won't understand what the assertion of values is and what the return to a past they believed they vanquished will be all about. They won't ruthlessly or even casually understand the question. And to want to win a battle of values and to want to resist a coming shift will be seen by those doing the fighting and the shifting. It will be seen correctly as ultimately losing the war. Thus, it is no wonder that Zone of Interest and Nuremberg, while they may be works of art in the early 2020s, are tired, defeated, and come off narratively as trying to say something meaningful about the values the West used to hold dear, but only in light of the fact that those values have been weakened by the very people who make the movies and create the art. And the people making those arguments are just too tired at this point in history. It's why, in contrast, there are leadership lessons to be learned from Eudora Welty's Optimist's Daughter that leaders and readers must sit with quietly and absorb. as the old, strong, and quiet ideas begin to reassert themselves just in time for our next cultural spring. And well, that's it for me. Are you ready to elevate your leadership journey through exploring the wisdom of the ages? Subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all major podcast platforms, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube Music. You can also find us everywhere else podcasts are available. If you find value in our episodes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, and of course, YouTube. We need those reviews to grow, and it is the truest way to help other leaders and lovers of literature discover this show. And thank you for your support.